And now we are recording. So I want to start by saying a huge thank you to everybody again for joining the session this week and to everybody who was able to join us last 2 weeks. We've been really thrilled with participation so far, especially the conversation that's been going on in the chat. So please keep that coming. And if you have questions throughout the session, please feel free to ask them as we go along. You are always welcome to use the raise hand function to comment publicly or to comment to myself or one of the speakers privately, and we will answer your questions that way. As far as logistics go for the sessions, broadly speaking, if you missed one of the sessions, that's totally fine. We understand that everybody has very busy lives, but please be sure to let me know that you are catching up on the recordings afterwards so that I can mark your participation for that week. As a reminder, you can find all of the recordings from each session on the website that's linked in the calendar invitation. And the session recording will be posted there by the end of the week when it's recorded. So for example, last week's recording just went up on Friday. You can watch it anytime this week and just shoot me an email to say that you've done that. So on that end, I want to say a big thank you also to our speakers for this week, to Irene Flannery, Christopher Mitchell, and Danae Wilson. We are so thrilled to have you all and are really looking forward to the conversation. So with that, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Katie. I'm Chris Mitchell with the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and today we're going to be talking about becoming an advocate and community consultations. I'm going to start off with some general observations that I've seen across a variety of situations, a lot of different local governments, rural organizing, urban organizing, different things that we've seen that have worked. And then Irene and Danae are going to be focusing more on tribal to tribal organizing and in discussions along those lines that they have much more expertise in than I do. But I wanted to start off with some general observations. I think the first thing that's useful is that most of us that are in this space didn't start off as experts in this. We didn't really take a lot of classes in it. We didn't spend years studying. We mostly just dove in and learned what we could from friends, mentors, and things like that. This is not a space where you need to go get a 4-year degree. It's not a space in which you need some kind of certificate. It is a space in which you can make a major difference by showing up and doing homework on your own effectively. I think it's exciting. That's one of the reasons I like to work in this space. If you're working in energy policy, it's not that way in a lot of ways. So, trying to improve your community with better internet access is definitely something that you can dive into and you can make a difference at just by sheer force of will and getting involved. And I think that's important because one of the big barriers that I think we face in trying to accomplish this isn't just the technical difficulties from the technology, it's not the economic challenges. In some cases, it's getting hope. It's making sure that communities feel that they actually can make a difference, because people have a lot of challenges, and people who are unconnected, often living in areas that have a history of being neglected for infrastructure, they may not have a sense that they're going to have a good internet access or that it's possible to solve this. One of the things to remember is that in the fight for electrification of the farms in rural America, it came about 50 years after electricity was more common in cities, and probably about 30 years after citywide electricity was more common. And I think a lot of people have a sense that it'll be maybe a long time, if ever, before they have connectivity across tribal areas, across Indian country. But we're going to get there. And I fundamentally believe that there will be a variety of technologies and approaches that will ultimately connect everyone. And I think making sure people know that is one of the jobs that we have to communicate. So as we're doing this, don't assume people understand that this is a problem we can solve. You have to be selling that in a lot of ways. This is the skills of becoming an advocate are in a positive way, a lot like sales skills. Not in the sense that you're trying to fool someone into a deal that's not good for them, but just in the sense that you have to be good at communication and recognizing that in many ways, this is a process, this communication, getting people excited, buy in to do this. You're asking that they put their faith in you, that they put their faith in the solution, that they invest time into it. And this is not just a fact of of what we have to do before the network is built. It's actually very similar to the process of making sure the network continues to succeed, making sure the network is maintained, making sure that the network is achieving the goals. Because fundamentally, we're not just trying to move bits around these communities, we're trying to create economic opportunities. We are trying to make sure that we have education. We're trying to preserve language and culture. Those things aren't going to magically happen when we have a good network connecting these different areas. There will be continued process that will require salesmanship, saleswomanship, those sorts of skills to make sure that we have the programs that are necessary to achieve those goals. So as you're easing into this and feeling like, yes, you can do it, I think it's important to note that there are a ton of materials. There are more materials available to you than you will ever be able to find. And I think it's important not to try to find them all. It's important to find ones that work for you. You know, if you're able to get a decent internet connection for a significant period of time, then there's all kinds of webinars. There's all kinds of discussions like this. I mean, even if you just look into the ISOC history, I'll bet you have many tens of hours of which you could educate yourself. So whether it's the podcasts, of which there are several now, with interviews about this sort of a thing, even conferences that have put their materials online. Increasingly, conferences are now online with materials that are available. And past webinars, there's a ton of material. If you don't have access to do a lot of that streaming stuff, then there's lots of reports. I don't think there's as many books. Like, I frankly wouldn't go looking for a lot of books on this subject, but there are a lot of shorter papers. There are articles to dig into, and other written materials that you can download when you have the connection and then review if you don't have it. But that's how you're going to want to educate yourself. And then the other piece is you really want to talk to people. You want to reach out to some of a lot of the folks that are presenting here are doing it because we want to talk to people about it. We'll help answer your questions. You're going to want to create those relationships because when something comes up, you may want to get a second opinion about how to handle it and that sort of a thing. So part of that education is making human relationships with people that have been there or who are going through the same thing so that you can talk through these sorts of things. So as we're looking at then, as we're educating ourselves and moving into it, it helps to have a regular meeting with a small group of people that are really focused on this. And one of the things that we've seen is the is one of the resources I put into the page of resources, which is a case study of a network in Minnesota, which is not on tribal lands, but is, I think, a good example of how communities organized and an important lesson that of what Mike Tyson would say, which is everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. So one of the things that I would say is steel yourself, because you're trying to organize something that is difficult and you're going to have adverse circumstances. That is going to be a metaphorical punch to the face. Hopefully no one will actually be violating anyone else's physical space. But be prepared, because this group that we wrote about in that case study that I included, you know, they spent 2 years in which they were organizing toward a plan that didn't work. And at the end of that time period, they certainly could have said, well, we gave it a lot of effort. We worked really hard and it didn't happen. And it's foolish for us to continue. But they did continue, and they were able to build a really high quality network that has brought connectivity to their region. They didn't know that at the time, though. And that's the part that I think is really key, is that when you're working on this, it may feel at times hopeless. That, again, is where I think it's important to reach out to other people and to talk about the challenges you're facing, you know, how you feel about it, and that sort of a thing, because ideally you will be at your depths of despair when someone else is really excited about a win that they've had, and you can share that. Or you're having a big win when other people are having frustrations, and it's important to share that so we can all keep moving forward. I think it's really important that we not ignore that sort of mental space that we're in, how we feel about doing this hard work as we're doing it. So as in that case study about this network in rural Minnesota, they had so many great organizing strategies that some of which I thought I did not expect to work as well as they did. One was that they did have the resources to mail everybody in the area a packet of information, and that cost them multiple thousands of dollars. In an area where you may not be able to raise that kind of money, you might have people that have enough time on their hands to be able to go around and hand off packets of information. Some of this information has been available in the past for free, where you could have someone ship you these magazines that were supported by ads to talk about the wonders of broadband networks and things like that. I have a link to a PDF that is called What Fiber Can Do for Your Community, which is not entirely appropriate when most of us are looking at building wireless networks. However, the goals are largely the same in terms of talking about the benefits of telehealth, the benefits of what broadband can do. And so you can look at those sorts of resources to pull snippets out and create a one page of information that you could then print off and give to a lot of folks or share via email. And to create this information, but don't underestimate the extent to which people will educate themselves if you make it easy on them. If you get them the information that you want them to read, a lot more people will read it than you may suspect. One of the strategies that this group did after they sent out all that material was they set up community meetings in order to discuss this. And what we often see from people that do this is they'll say, okay, next month we're going to have a meeting at 7 o'clock at this location. And these folks actually said, you know what, these communities are varied that we're trying to talk to. We are going to have 3 meetings per day. We're going to have a morning meeting, an afternoon meeting, and an evening meeting. And they're not going to be, massive meetings that each have hundreds of people, but we'll be able to talk to folks, and we'll make sure that anyone who wants to learn about this approach will have a chance to learn about it. And so again, if you are able to organize people that have more time and they can dedicate to being at these meetings, think about it in those terms, because you want to try to widen that net to talk to people who might not be available in the evenings. And use that ability to have extra meetings that might be smaller and have more conversation. It's really important to keep breaking things down, and in some ways it's helpful to do that by deputizing people in your group to do it. As you hear them talk about it, it might give you ideas, but one of the ways to really help get this information out is have different people present it in the way that they feel is useful, because they'll have different perspectives that they bring to it that might not be how you thought of it. Different groups have used newspaper ads or other common places, other common advertising mechanisms, if they could raise the money for it, to have a regular, even small ad that would direct them to the right people to get more information about it. Some people put signs in their yards. There's even one group that, a city that has, where people take their trash to a central place rather than having it picked up curbside. And so they had regular discussions with folks at that location. If there's a place where a lot of people in your community meet, just go there and talk to them about broadband and about what can be done. And along those lines, trying to remember. Let's see. This is what happens when you don't follow your notes exactly. Somewhere in here is a bullet that I'm looking for. When you're having these discussions, I think it's important to again try to get people to buy in. And you may be surprised at people that may not be the most obvious champions that will come out and do it. But these conversations are really important. The thing I was trying to remember was surveys. Surveys are often used to collect data. However, surveys are also a really sneaky way of just getting ideas out there. And so, a survey that is saying, what do you think about this approach? Or what do you think about that approach? Means that you're putting those ideas into people's heads. They may start conversations around them. And so you should think of surveys both as being a way of trying to get a sense of where the community's at, but also trying to get your ideas out into the community. And then I also wanted to put one other thing. I think I talked about this in the other presentation that I was doing along the other track, which I know many people are also doing, and that's the Michigan Moonshot. When it comes to surveys, if you do a search for Michigan Moonshot, it's an organization in Michigan that is doing a lot of really good work putting together all the best resources we've seen for community networks in different strategies in different communities. They have a whole approach to surveying that is off the charts, from getting the surveys into unexpected people's hands, working deals with pizza companies so that the pizza when you order a pizza and it gets delivered, it actually has a survey stapled to the box. All kinds of interesting ideas to try to reach different audiences to get ideas out there. And I've really enjoyed how they've collected this different approaches under this rubric of the Michigan Moonshot. And then the final thing is that, again, door to door, if you have people in your group who are retired or who have that time, and you can go around and talk to neighbors face to face, it's something in these communities that when people know each other, that can really go a long ways. And so I strongly encourage recognizing when you have assets like people who have the time to do that sort of a thing, the willingness, and ideally some level of communication skills that they're not going to alienate people by describing things incorrectly or offensively, is to make sure that you're tapping into that and getting that information out. The last thing I just want to end with is that I feel like it is really important to make sure that we are spreading this message of hope, that this is not too complicated. This is something that seems challenging just because we may not have done it before, but that fundamentally many people have built home networks, and we're just trying to build one that's a little bit bigger than that to connect more people. It's something that we can do. It's something that will be done, and if people take the right effort with the right strategy, it'll happen in the very near future rather than 5 or 10 years from now. So with that, I want to hand it over to Irene for some more specific guidance. Thank you. Irene, I think you're muted on the telephone line.
How about that?
There we go. Yes, you sound great.
There we go. Sorry, having a few technical issues here on that. That's the the punishment I get for taking a few days off. Welcome everybody to this afternoon's session. My name is Irene Flannery. I am currently the director of AMERIND Critical Infrastructure. We are a division within AMERIND Risk, which is actually a tribally owned, 100% tribally owned insurance company. I head up the only non-insurance part of the business. We were created to help tribes bring broadband to their communities. I spent 14 years at the Federal Communications Commission, so I bring the, as my colleague Jeff Blackwell and I like to say, I'm a recovering Fed. I bring the perspective of a senior policymaker back in the day. I've been here at AMERIND for about 4.5 years now. So today we're going to focus on what I'm going to focus on, building on all of the things that Chris was talking about as well, is that community, and specifically tribal community to tribal community engagement, and the engagement between tribal communities and their tribal governments, and also between tribes and the federal government and state governments as well, as they look to build to bring broadband connectivity to their communities. So if we can go to the next slide. What I'm going to do today, AMERIND is located on the Santa Ana Pueblo in New Mexico. We are just north of Albuquerque on the way, for any of you familiar, going up I-25 between Albuquerque and Santa Fe. What I'm going to do today is to illustrate the power of engagement and the power of advocacy. I'm going to walk through a couple of case studies of projects that we have had the privilege of working on here in the state of New Mexico. Again, there's no one size fits all. We always like to say it's more like one size fits none. But there are a lot of great nuggets of information as you look at the opportunities to band together potentially with other groups and bring connectivity to your communities. So the picture here, the focus that I'm going to have today is on some fiber networks that we have had the privilege of helping to build here in New Mexico. But all of these, as Chris was saying, all of these lessons can be equally applied to building wireless networks as well. The engagement is engagement, and it's extremely powerful. I'm sure it may look very familiar to you, those big old orange spirals. That's the conduit that the fiber goes in. That's actually AMERIND. Those are our offices right there on Santa Ana. And the project, one of the projects that I'm going to talk about, this was when the fiber was coming. We're on Santa Ana. Santa Ana was one of the parties in one of these networks that was built. And this was, you know, preparation day when the conduit was there and they were about to trench into the ground. And on the left-hand side is in one of the Pueblo communities. That's the equipment getting ready to trench the fiber into the ground. So if you just picture the scene, it's rural New Mexico. Unfortunately, the FCC for some programs doesn't consider this part of New Mexico to be rural because it's somewhat close to Albuquerque and Santa Fe, but it is extremely rural for anyone who has ever been to any of the Pueblo communities here in New Mexico. There's been a history of very poor and very expensive internet connectivity, if it existed. The incumbent providers, the big companies like the CenturyLinks of the world, really had no interest in bringing the kind of connectivity that the Pueblos wanted and needed for their communities. And even the funding, even the federal funding mechanisms that were available seem to have left the Pueblo communities behind, at least up until a point. But so if we advance to the next slide, just to take a step back, because this is going to be very relevant to some of the information that I share with you. This is one funding example. This is the funding that is available through the Federal Communications Commission. The FCC is not like the big federal government agencies that many of you are familiar with, like the Department of Agriculture or the Department of Commerce. It's a relatively small independent agency. It doesn't have grant and loan making authority, but it does manage the largest source of federal funding for broadband connectivity. I'll just quickly go over these programs. If you add up the numbers at the bottom, you come up to about $11 billion. This is annual money. This is not money that is appropriated through the federal government. It doesn't have to go through the congressional budgeting process. The money comes from all of us. We pay a surcharge on our telephone bill, whether it's wireline or wireless. It goes into this big, what's called the Universal Service Fund. And there are 4 programs that allocate this money to specific groups. So the Lifeline program, some of you may have heard of that. Many of you, I hope, have heard of it. That is a program. All of these programs used to help provide funding for telephone service, but it now applies to broadband service. The Lifeline program provides a discount for telephone and or broadband connectivity to low-income communities. It's the only one of these 4 programs that has a tribal-specific component. There is a tribal Lifeline program that provides a higher per month subsidy amount to low-income households on tribal lands. The high cost program, that's basically a corporate subsidy. Back in the day, the idea of the high cost, or some of you may have heard it referred to as the Connect America Fund, was to provide an incentive for providers, for telephone and now broadband providers, to come out to parts of rural and remote America and build their network. So it's basically a subsidy that helps them to offset their costs. It's just more expensive to provide service in rural and remote areas, which is true of most tribal lands. The Schools and Libraries program, that's the E-rate program. That's the one that we're going to focus on just for purposes of these case studies. That's a program, this is a program that provides discounts to schools and libraries to bring broadband connectivity to their campuses. It provides discounts of up to 95% off the cost of service, which means that, and that's all based on poverty. The FCC measures poverty based on eligibility for the free and reduced price lunch program. So for schools with a high percentage of students eligible for the free and reduced price lunch program, they can qualify for a discount of up to 95% off the cost of bringing connectivity to the school or the library, which means, let's just say, a network isn't going to cost $100, but just for ease of calculations, if the network costs $100, the federal government would pay $95, and the school or library would pay $5. And you'll see the power of that as we move through here. And then the rural healthcare program, very much like E-rate on a much smaller scale, but it has the same goals except for telemedicine. So it helps to provide connectivity for rural healthcare providers. So if we go to the next slide, this will, so what the power of community engagement and tribal engagement is in many cases there's strength in numbers. So what we're looking at here were two different projects. One we called the Middle Rio Grande Consortium. That went from Santa Ana going up north through San Felipe, Santo Domingo, and Cochiti. The other project was the Jemez and Zia Pueblos going from east to west. The very real problem, the way this all started, was actually a fairly simple, what everyone thought was a fairly simple problem. The Santa Fe Indian School is a tribally controlled school in Santa Fe, and it provides education to children from across all of the pueblos. It's largely a residential school. What it was looking to do was to provide language classes in all of the different Pueblo languages without having to bring individual teachers in to the school. So the Santa Fe Indian School had good connectivity. They've used the E-rate program for years and years. But what they found when they were trying to connect to the individual Pueblo communities is the Pueblo communities didn't have any connectivity. So they couldn't link. The goal was, well, let's link maybe to the library of a native language speaker who can then teach remotely. That's what started this whole process. So a number of the Pueblos, this took years. As Chris was saying, you can't be discouraged by initial failures or initial challenges, because this did take a number of years for the Pueblos to come together, to be able to put together an agreement between, let's take the Middle Rio Grande. So that's Santa Ana, the one that's going north-south, going up to Cochiti. The level of engagement that was required was extraordinary. So it started small, though. So what's so critically important in bringing broadband connectivity to communities is it's okay to start small. Think big, but start small. And it's having a champion within each community is critically important. One person can't do all of this. One community can't necessarily do all of this together. Again, this is an example. This isn't the only way that you can proceed. But what the four Pueblos did is they had a champion within each of their communities. They had to work very closely and over a number of years to work with their Pueblo governments, both to educate the government in terms of what was possible, that this seemed insurmountable at first. Really, to build a tribally owned network, we're talking 30 miles of fiber that goes from Cochiti all the way down through Santa Ana. So after years of engagement, and it was a little easier with Jemez and Zia because Middle Rio Grande kind of broke the ground first. They were the first tribal consortium that together filed for the E-rate program. So that initial community engagement, which then grew from community to community. So each of these Pueblos had to negotiate with one another as they're building a common network, but with ownership. Each of the Pueblos owns the fiber that's on their own land. And then as you see down that little yellow box, that really does say McDonald's. The fiber all connects down behind the McDonald's in Bernalillo, New Mexico, right off Santa Ana, and connects to leased dark fiber that takes them into Albuquerque so they can get very high-speed, inexpensive internet access. But there are so many forms of advocacy here that involved both the individual Pueblo communities, getting everybody on board, negotiating and working and engaging between and among the Pueblo communities and the Pueblo governments. There is a match. So when I mentioned for the E-rate program, the schools and libraries program, if the government pays, if the federal government, the Universal Service Fund pays for 95%, there's still that 5%, which isn't insignificant when you're talking about networks that might cost $4 million, when you're talking a fiber network that's 30 miles long. So there was a really unique level of engagement between the Pueblo governments and the state government. The state government actually provided some of the match for some of the entities within the Pueblo communities. And then the federal government. Invariably, something will come up. There will be a bump in the road. That's just, especially when you're breaking new ground, both literally and figuratively, there will be bumps in the road. So there was the need to go to the Federal Communications Commission for one of these consortia for a waiver of one of the rules to make sure that the project could actually be completed. And what this all sets the stage for is that these were two very successful projects. There's another project in the state of New Mexico, and I don't mean to just focus on New Mexico, because these projects can happen anywhere. But the Acoma Pueblo also followed a somewhat similar process, except their consortium was between and among themselves. So their school and their library formed a consortium, but used this same federal source of money. And so what this also proved to the FCC, so there had been one of the challenges with the E-rate program is that tribal schools and libraries were well underrepresented in the program. These projects have put tribal schools and libraries on the map in many ways. So the FCC can point to them and say, well, look, it can be done. Tribal communities have come together. They've built their own, they own the network. They own the fiber in the ground. And there are also ways that connectivity can be leveraged out beyond schools and libraries to the greater community. And just the last slide, just to give you a sense of what the end result was. So if you look on the table to the left, these were the speeds in blue. These were some of the applicants that were part of the Jemez and Zia consortium. In blue, those were the speeds, the broadband speeds. You can see as low as 1.5 megabits. Our cell phones have 10, 12, I don't even know how many megs they have now. But through this consortium, through working together, engaging their communities, forming this consortium, applying for the federal funding, immediately their speeds went up to 100 megabits. So it was a dramatic increase in speed. And then if you look to the right, the impact on cost. So you can see the Jemez Day School was paying as high as almost $284 per megabit for their service before this consortium and this group of advocates came together. And once they formed the consortium, they applied for funding, they're now paying $6.90 per megabit, which is discounted. So again, just the power of advocacy between and among communities. Don't be afraid to start small. All of these communities started with a burning desire, but started with not a tremendous amount of knowledge in the beginning, and banded together and have become a powerful force here in the state of New Mexico. So I will turn it back to if Danae is with us, or
yeah, I'm
whoever's up next. Hi, Danae.
Hi. So I didn't send in a PowerPoint presentation. I was going to send some slides in, but Sunday I had an allergic reaction to some food. And so I've been dealing with hives, and it literally ended up being burns on my face, but I'm all in the good. So so my apologies that I don't have slides, but I do want to talk to you guys. I have some great information. My name is Danae Wilson. I'm on the Nez Perce Reservation, and I live and work here in North Central Idaho. and I've been really fortunate to make my career here. I do a lot of advocacy for Indian country in general. I happen to sit on 2 FCC committees. I sit on the Intergovernmental Affairs Committee, and I'm currently the co-chair of the Native Nations Communications Task Force. I also sit on the FirstNet Tribal Working Group. I'm the Tribal Working Group Chair for that committee, and I represent National Congress of American Indian. I hold their seat on FirstNet, on the FirstNet board. So Theron Retna and I co-chair the SAFECOM committee on behalf of National Congress of American Indians. I also am the co-chair with Crystal Hottaway to the Affiliated Tribes of Northwest Indians Telecommunications and Technology Committee, and I'm a current board member of Native Public Media. And so I'm very passionate about getting resources and information out to tribes and to advocate on behalf of Native nations in all arenas. Yesterday, I happened to be a speaker at a natural resources focused training, and the point of the training was to talk about how broadband can impact and advance natural resources, monitoring what they're doing in terms of technology and advocacy for their protection of the environment, climate control, any of those, smart ag, any of those technologies. And what I think is really interesting is when we're talking about connecting our communities, we're not just talking about what we do in terms of education and high-speed internet and entrepreneurship. It really is air quality monitor, fire monitoring. It really is a resource for the entire community. It isn't just making sure people can get to the internet. And I think that's lost in a lot of our deployments. We talk about E-rate, we talk about let's make sure we can, how do we fund it? But we're not always addressing how it lifts our entire region and how our entire region can benefit from what we're doing in terms of connectivity and technology. So just for those of you who are on here, there's resources that I think may get lost in the shuffle. We heard from Chris a little bit about how you can do a search on the internet and find resources, and some of the resources I think that are significantly important is some of the resources would be like WISPALOOZA is a great conference. I sent staff to WISPALOOZA and it was eye-opening. You know, they hadn't ever thought about connectivity in terms of outside of what we're doing on the Nez Perce Reservation. And when you're doing a search, you may be looking for connecting tribal communities, but community networks is probably the more searchable term instead of tribal community networks. Community networks have been around for a long time. You've seen in some of the links that MUNI networks, MUNI is municipal networks. So when you're looking for examples and resources, you may not be looking specifically for tribal, but you may be looking for more general broad terms where this has already been done someplace else. We're not building a new wheel. We're taking what fits other areas and we're adapting it to make it work for us in our tribal lands. And so having those resources and knowing what some of those terms are makes a major difference in your search. Looking for tribal networks, you may find 60 to 70 examples of tribal networks on tribal lands, and most of them are started as traditional telcos. You find very few information on the web about WISPs in general, wireless, fixed wireless internet providers. You wouldn't search that and find tribal. You would search that and find municipal networks in other cities. You may be very hard pressed to find data specific to tribes. So I just want to make a couple caveats in terms of making sure that there are resources available to you, and knowing the right terms sometimes makes it easier to search. And definitely there's a ton of us advocating for communities, many of us who are more than willing to share our experience and our knowledge and any information that we have. But when you are doing searches, it's very, very difficult to see tribal networks in general. You'd be very hard pressed to do a search on the internet and find tribal networks and examples of tribal networks. And so in terms of community outreach and advocating in your own community, we always start with the most obvious, right? Your schools and libraries, your tribal governments. So you start with the most obvious and find out what they're doing for their services. Your health clinics, what are they doing for their services, and are they happy with those services? How much is it costing them per month? You know, starting with some of the most obvious users of the internet, and then reaching out to those who may not be traditional users of the internet, or who you might have thought might not need it. The Forest Service, the Park Service, where tribal lands are all in very remote areas, and our neighbors are federal forest services in the US for the most part. We are in rural locations for the most part, and our neighbors aren't a city like Albuquerque or Santa Fe. They're the National Forest Service. And the National Forest Service, all of us have federal lands adjacent to or next to. So sometimes your neighbor may have a need for deployment and may need services. And so including them as part of your build means that you have a new anchor institute, right? And an anchor institute gives you the means to build sustainability, because you know that agency isn't going anywhere. That school, that library, that park service, they're going to be there for the long haul. And so that is the basis for your sustainability long term. So when you go to your community, your tribal community, you can say, we're looking to build this network. And sometimes people will be thinking, well, how much is it going to cost us? Where's that money going to come from? Then you have the ability to say, we're working with our partners, and list all of your partners who you're building with. And there may be partners who you hadn't thought about. Homeland Security is a huge funder on tribal lands. They build the roads, they put in the generators, and they put the fences around your tribal assets. So tapping into some resources that you hadn't thought of before. Public Works, working with your utilities is another really great avenue for you to look at doing deployment. And so when you're doing these surveys, when you're talking to your community, it really is very important to say, of course, in tribal lands, I never say I. Like, if you rarely will ever hear me say I did, because it's us, right? We built this, we're building this, we did this together. And so those transitions for us really make a major difference in terms of making sure we're inclusive. We want to include HUD, we want the tribal housing units, we want to include transportation and the roads department, which may sometimes be Bureau of Indian Affairs, and so at least in the US. So you want to think about including all the people that are going to help your project succeed. And those successes are going to be a community success, because when we are successful, we don't just lift up our tribal lands, we lift up all the lands around us. So when Tribal Lifeline first came out, we took full ownership of it and said, Tribal Lifeline is, these are our people, and they're going to service our people. So we negotiated the rate, the plan, and the type of phones that were going to be distributed. And then we made sure that they were going to be coming from, all the service and support was coming right from the tribe. So we took it from a different approach than most other areas. We didn't have cellular companies out here selling people saying, I'll sign you up for a Tribal Lifeline phone and we'll give you 30 of them. We said, no, these are our people. This is our community, and we're going to take ownership of it. So as soon as you take ownership of something, you have to start planning, right? You have to start being inclusive. When it first came out, I really thought that it would be like 50 people. I didn't have any clue, not my wheelhouse, not what I do, right? I don't do cellular service. I don't do telephone service to the home or to the individual. So I went to my social services, my commodity foods, USDA food and service program, my Indian health, to our Head Start programs. And I said, what do you think would be the total number of people who could benefit from the Tribal Lifeline program? And our commodity service director, she was sitting next to me, and she just started laughing and said, I have 200 of my own clients who would be able to sign up for that. Forget all of them. What you've done is just a drop in the bucket. I had no idea. So what you don't know, you truly don't know, right? So I said, okay, so educate me. So several meetings later, I got this big picture. and you have an aha moment that what you're doing is going to impact people. I happened to be at the grocery store, and a little gal came up to me. I didn't know who she was. And she said, I just want to thank you. I got a job at our casino, and it's because I had a tribal lifeline phone. I would have never known the personal impact, and I didn't know she knew who I was, but I didn't do anything other than put two people together to make sure the service was delivered, right? So sometimes your impact may not be, you think that you're just collecting this information from people, you're just doing community outreach about internet, right? You just want to bring a network to your community. Sometimes the impacts are huge and you don't even know it until somebody makes you aware that how much of your work has impacted their lives. In this case, this young mother was able to get a job and become employable and no longer needed the social programs to support her and her family. She was able to start her career and open the door to the casino. And now, happy to say, she completed all the courses and is our hotel manager and is doing really wonderful things for her and her family. And it all started with just one connection, just one person getting one telephone number to get a call back for a job. So you never really know what your impacts are. I've put some of the type of outreach that we do on tribal lands. We really did partner with our Commodity Foods program. Commodity Foods doesn't serve just tribal homes, it serves everybody who qualifies for it, right? Native and non-native. So it truly is a good community baseline for how many people would be interested in service, both elderly and young. It's all across ages. So it really did give me a basis. This is how many people need connectivity. This is how many people are choosing not to have it because they can't afford it. So that baseline, that flyer that we put in, the food distribution program, made a big difference. The next place we went was to students, and we went to students and we had really simple questions because we wanted elementary age and high school age just to give us a few minutes of their time. Tell us, what do you need in your home to be connected? And sometimes it was just a tablet. Sometimes it was a cellular service. In some cases, they said, we have a computer, but it's ancient, right? It doesn't have any of the new software programs on it. So yeah, we have a computer at home, but it can't do anything beyond basic, very basic typewriter type of thing. That's how they saw the computer in their home, because it wasn't running any of the new software that their school was running. So when we're doing community outreach, we try to make sure that we have a broad range. And when we first did our network, before we even talked about internet to the home, we talked about internet skills, because it's going to take time to build these networks, right? So you want to build the skills as you're building the network so that the resource becomes usable immediately. And so what we did is we went to our senior citizens. They have birthday lunches once a month for throughout our community. So in Lapwai, in Orfino, in Kamiai, so throughout the reservation, they have a birthday lunch where everybody gets bussed in, or they get to come in and socialize and have a day with other elderlies. And so we went to those elderly programs, and we brought cell phones, we brought tablets, we brought gaming systems. And so the gaming systems were super simple, right? They were just match 3 games or gambling games. And so just to get them used to holding technology in their hand and using technology. And then we transitioned them from whatever baseline they were at into something better. And so it took us 6-8 months in order to do this. And we had a lot of volunteers help us. So it wasn't paid staff doing this, but in order to make sure everybody benefited from the network coming on to the reservation, we wanted tribal engagement, and we wanted to bring everybody's skills up. We wanted to see everybody have an opportunity to use this benefit to its absolute fullest. So we made every effort to bring our entire community along. We talked to our housing office, and our housing office does financial literacy to do home ownership. It's a requirement of their funding agency, HUD. And so HUD, before you can buy a house, you have to go through financial literacy. And at one point in time, those were centers. You had to go into the HUD center to do the financial literacy. And what we found is especially now, doing remote sessions is much more valuable. It helps people not miss work, not have to pay for gas to get to a location to do these literacy classes, and it makes differences in people's lives. So what we did is we set up stations in the community center, and we're broadcasting those financial literacy classes. And at the end of the class, they can take a test to prove that they were participating in the class. But we had staff there in the community center who were ready to help them walk through the test to make sure that they got credit for the financial literacy. So we were able to open the door to 20, 25 new homeowners that wouldn't have had that opportunity to take that class because they would have had to drive to a HUD training center in order to get those classes to be considered financially literate to purchase a home. I don't know if anybody's ever literate to buy a home. You get into a home and you have to make mortgage payments and insurance and everything else, right? But it was really good to think that we were able to help by engaging our community. Other things that you wouldn't typically think would be a benefit to your community network and helping your community be engaged in what you're doing in deployment right now, especially is you know, everybody's talking about how difficult it is right now on reservations for at-home school, and it's a huge challenge, I get it. And working from home is a huge challenge. That's a real problem. I totally understand it. But we have shut-ins. We have people who are not able to leave their house for groceries. And while some people are able to get onto the internet and order their groceries and then drive in and pick it up, it isn't the luxury that everybody has on reservation. So we have a very young lady. She just graduated with her master's degree from Montana University, and she started her Facebook page. And not everybody has Facebook, but she said, I just want to do a community drive to make sure that our shut-ins, the people who can't get out, the people who don't have a vehicle, are still getting food, are still getting medical PPE and getting cleaning supplies to their homes. And so it was really organic. She just started a Facebook page, and then the radio station stepped in and said, well, let's help her by broadcasting her website, and let's get this information out for her on this website. In the end, she ended up with 120 or so volunteers who are delivering food boxes and PPE and cleaning supplies to people's homes. But it started with one person on a Facebook page, and not everybody had Facebook, but that information went viral, right? On the reservation, people were calling their brothers saying, you can get a food box, they have cleaning supplies. And so making every effort to share information on reservation really just starts with one person, and what do you need to get out, and how are you going to get that information out? So there's a lot of different ways to engage your community in outreach, in education, and include them in any decisions about what your infrastructure is doing and what it can be used for. So we make every effort to ensure that our local growers, our people who are starting gardens, who want to do farmers market, have an avenue to broadcast and advertise, and what do they need, and how do we help them be successful in whatever entrepreneurial business that they're trying to do. My sister's a seamstress. She's a teacher. That's her job. She's a teacher. She loves being a teacher, but teacher salaries don't cover all the bills. So she sells her skills and abilities on the internet. And so she does a really good job about bringing in business and getting business out, but how do we help other people do something similar, especially in this time? And so starting something that is beneficial to one person can easily be expanded to include other people. Now in her sewing circle, there's probably 75 people. They're making everything from quilts to coats to face masks for our law enforcement. I mean, it just spread like crazy. It really does just start with a single person who has one point of interest, and then spreading that through your community can make everything be significantly better in your rural, remote locations. Yesterday, one of the things that we talked about in the natural resources training that I was on, one of the individuals on the Coeur d'Alene reservation, he is going to be starting a farming entity, and he's working with individuals at Colville who will be doing outreach at Colville. And so he said, how did you start with your farmer's market? Well, we just started with my son and I. We set up a stand, we sold my excess vegetables and my excess fruits. And we had our traditional foods that we gathered that we gave away for free to make sure traditional foods were on our Nez Perce tables so anybody could benefit from it, right? So you just started with one thing and then it blew up. We wrote a grant to our extension agent. We had that grant available to us to purchase a rototiller. We rototilled one strip for anybody who wanted it. Anybody could ask for it and had them grow their garden. And the next thing you know, people are posting on their Facebook page that there's a new farmer's market and there's jams, there's jellies, there's homemade bread, there's traditional foods, there's vegetables and produce. So then you start getting this huge interest in what you're doing to bring food to a food desert, right? Food where it's really difficult to get fresh fruits and vegetables, costs a lot of money. You have to drive 30 minutes away to even get it. And in some locations, it's much further than that than it is for us. We happen to live in a very centralized area where 30 minutes in any direction will hit a town essentially. So whatever that town's resources are, we have access to that town's resources. So, but some locations where he was talking about in Calvo would be considered a food desert. You know, how do you get food to that location? We had a gentleman on from Navajo Nation who specifically talked about 6 stores to service the whole reservation, which is the size of Rhode Island. You know, could you imagine the whole state of Rhode Island only having 6 stores? And you could only buy from those 6 stores, right? Unless you had to travel hours to go to a bigger store, to a bigger town. So you never know what your network is going to bring. You never know what your community outreach is going to bring until you take that first step. And once you take that first step, it definitely always leads you to the next step. What is that next step? So your community network, when you're building these community networks, it is only a resource. It's a tool in the toolbox to make life in your region better. And I like to tell people that the network isn't going to fix everything. Internet, we're bringing internet to these communities. It doesn't fix everything. I was very fortunate to be with ISOC when we were in Northern Territories. It was a phenomenal trip. It was beautiful to be there, but it really was the start of the internet for them, right? It was the very start. And so at Inuvik, they were very concerned about outside inputs on their community and what it was going to do to their community. And there was a real fear, and there can be a real fear. But overcoming those fears and making sure that your community has resources that it wouldn't otherwise have, because the internet doesn't solve anything and it only brings you tools to make life better for the location you're at. It doesn't solve your social issues. It doesn't make life better automatically by lighting up a signal. It's what you do with the tool. And so when you're thinking about doing research and your community engagement, what is the issue that you're trying to resolve, and how can technology help resolve that issue? And that's really where your community engagement, where the rubber hits the road, right? Where you need to know, yeah, it's great to bring these networks to communities. There's a lot of resources to bring these communities to networks to communities, but there has to be a purpose, more than just lighting up a signal, more than just how much is it going to cost on an annual basis, more than how many customers do we have to make it sustainable. How is it going to be used? How does it benefit your livelihood? And how does it make your regions more productive? What issues are we solving? And your networks definitely need to take that into consideration when you're planning them. So you're not planning just to run down Main Street and have everybody on Main Street get good connectivity and everybody off Main Street, well, they get connection, but it's not that great of a connection, right? You want to include everybody. You want to make sure that the person that lives out in the country like I do gets a connection point, and not just the people who live in town. You want to make sure that you're inclusive of your entire community and where they live and work, and how is this going to benefit them in their current situation, and what can it do to improve life for that individual. So community engagement is huge, and there's a lot of different ways to address your own community. We did the birthday dinners. Tribes typically have a annual or biannual tribal meeting where all tribal people come together for these meetings. Now many of those meetings are being held virtual. So how are you getting that meeting information out to your people? How are they engaged? And when you do engage them, is it meaningful? Is it two-way communication? Do we have an opportunity for them to express their needs and their interests, or is it just a one-way, a sounding board where you just receive information and they don't have any way of interacting? So making sure that we have engagement that is all inclusive, that it is a two-way street, that you're hearing and identifying what the need is and building according to the need, and not just building based on sustainability or the bottom line. And definitely not just building towards the funding resource, right? So E-rate will pay for this connection from A to B, but then beyond B, there's nothing. No, when we're building our networks, we want to be able to go all the way through the alphabet and make sure everybody gets connected, and that all along the way we have a plan to extend that network to ensure it's inclusive. And it all starts with, what does our community need and how do we get it to them? So it's really super impressive that ISOC is holding these classes. Again, we did something similar last year, and I enjoyed hearing from the individuals and the places they came from. We had several First Nations from Canada who talked about the issues that they may be having with their governments, and it's very interesting to hear what's happening in other countries with other Indigenous people and their connectivity. And so this training session will hopefully help us identify ways that we can get individuals to communicate with their governments. Some states in the lower 48 work really well with their tribes and others do not. I happen to live in a state where partnership between the state and the tribe is just now starting to come together in the last 2 years. But what brought us together is broadband and connecting these very rural areas where the tribes have been funding their infrastructure builds themselves, and the state now, especially under COVID, needs that connectivity. And so we're starting to see some developments where now the states are saying, hey, we see you tribes, and we understand that you've already been building. How can we contribute to that build to include the surrounding communities? And that's a real phenomenal thing. It's a change in politics, and politics that you thought would never change. And in other states like Washington State and Oregon, those states work really, really well with the tribes and have seen them from the very beginning as a necessary, important partner, and they build together. So it really does depend on you and your region and what that outreach looks like. So not only your tribal constituency, but also your regional. We do a lot of outreach to chambers of commerce on the towns surrounding around the reservation and on reservation. If there is a chamber of commerce, we work with city governments, city councils, and we've connected a lot of city buildings to the tribal network to ensure that those towns have good connectivity and good telephone service. Couple of years ago, it was probably 10, 12 years ago now, in Clearwater County on Nez Perce Reservation, the local telco went down, the power went out, and for 3 days they couldn't repair the telephone system. So the sheriff's office and volunteers were literally going door to door, giving people verbal updates on a daily basis to an entire county to ensure that those individuals were updated on what was happening in that county. And so they turned to the tribe. Historically, that county was 100% against the tribe, and they turned to the tribe and said, your infrastructure didn't go down when ours did. How can we partner to ensure that our networks stay up like yours and that we can still reach our communities? And so we helped them develop a disaster recovery plan, and now we are their backup, and they are on all of our systems. So now if the power goes out, if we have any type of issue with infrastructure, we are their alternate, and they can back up right to us and stay up and still be able to communicate with their community. So you don't know who your partners could be, but it all starts with that first conversation and stepping out of your comfort zone. Did I want to go to those city council meetings? No, I didn't want to go to those city council meetings. And a lot of times you're sitting there thinking, why the hell am I doing this? And then you have one good conversation with one person and it snowballs into something that can be really fruitful for your entire region. And then being there in that uncomfortable spot, only woman, only minority, and you still see the fruits of your labor definitely blossom into something that can be really, really good. So engagement outside of your area, and then nationally, regionally, being a tribal person engaged, being an Indigenous person engaged in your regional and your national level. There's very, very few of us who are advocating on a national level. I mean, you can count, it's, you know, I always say it's the same 20 of us. We sort of rotate in and out. And so we want more and more people to step forward and say, this is what I can bring to the table. This is the type of time commitment I can give, and we're all doing such great works that making sure that we have more resources to represent us on a national and a state level. We see it in SAFECOM. There's only 2 of us for the entire US. SAFECOM sets all of the hospital emergency response, law enforcement emergency response, and there's 2 tribal members. And we can't sit on every single committee, right? So Forest Service, you think of every single law enforcement and first responder agency is part of SAFECOM. And there's only 2 Indigenous people, 2 Native people on that for that entire organization, and they're setting the policy, the rules that everybody has to play by for the entire nation. And so you think, well, I can't have an impact, but you can have an impact if you engage, and if you make sure that your engagement is coming from a place of, this is what happens in my region, this is what's happening nationally, this is what I'm being told by the tribal people that I'm working with, so that you can help ensure that Indigenous people are representative on these national committees and on committees that are influencing what's going to happen on our reservation. So it goes beyond your tribal lands and your community, your region. It really is advocacy on a large playing field, and making sure you're engaged and you know what's happening on a large playing field, because sometimes your voice will be the only Native voice that's heard, and that voice needs to be powerful and impactful. So making sure that whatever you have to say, whatever you have to add is what they need to hear. It doesn't have, you don't have to be the expert in your field. You don't have to be the person who put the network up. You don't have to be that person. You just have to be the person advocating for your community and for minorities in general, but definitely for Native peoples. That advocacy goes a very long ways, and we have very few people that are taking that first initial step to do on a national, international level. And having that resource and engagement is extremely beneficial when you're talking about just engagement in general, but tribal engagement specifically. We really need those resources. So essentially, I didn't want to go on and on, so that's what I have, and hopefully we have some time for some questions. And I see a bunch coming up in the chat, and so I don't know, Katie, are we going to go through some of the questions?
Yes, and first of all, thank you, Danae. Thank you, Irene and Chris, for your great information. This has been really, really interesting, and I appreciate it a lot. I think a lot of the questions that have been posted have actually been answered already through
good
comments. Anybody who did not have your question answered already, though, I apologize, I missed it. Please use either the raise hand feature or just comment the word hand in the chat right now, and I'll go ahead and call on you. Give it 30 seconds or so. Okay, so I would love to open up the floor then to see if we, if you have not already posted a question but have some, it'd be great to hear. Also, this is a great opportunity too to talk about your own experience. If you have things that you've heard and you're like, wow, yes, me too, I have this link in my own community or in my own work, this is a great opportunity to talk about it and sort of do some informal networking as a group, just to see sort of what everybody is working on and what the ties are. So I'll pause here and see if anybody wants to be brave and raise their hand. Gabriel, I can see you speaking, but you're on mute. Do you want to unmute yourself, or am I calling on you and putting you on the spot?
No, no, that's fine. You know, I think that all the speakers have really hit the critical points that make networks successful, because it's not just only about the tribal network. It's not only about the municipal network. It's about the community and the collaboration. If you look statistically at these small networks that try to deploy nationwide, their success rate is a lot lower if they're not collaborating. Like in my region, one of the biggest obstacles are easements and being able to get fiber cable between one community to the next. There's basically a tribe that refuses to work with the incumbent, so there's no fiber going beyond that point. So there's community networks that have sprung up to allow for some of that, but the collaboration is key, and Danae hit a lot of great points and puts the passion back in why we do what we do, because you know, you could hear it in her heart and in her spirit, what she's doing. Irene's intellectual look at all the FCC and where we can grab that money, that's always important to all of us. And how do we, you know, and how are we creative with that without going too far? And that's where Irene's always been beneficial. So, you know, I really appreciate everything that's here. And I think that this is actually a good, this one is a good presentation on collaboration. I like the idea about pizza boxes and getting information out that way. That's pretty clever as well. But if you put your mind to it, I guess anything's possible. So you know, I don't mean to steal the floor for so long, but thank you.
Thanks, Gabriel. Really appreciate that. And no, not stealing the floor at all. I think this is really the right time to sort of talk about your own experiences and ask questions and see where we have loops, because a lot of the individuals on these calls have experience in some way, whether you know it or not, in doing community consultations. We do it all the time, and they're so important. And the more you do it, I think the more you realize how important it is and how difficult it can be sometimes. So it's really great to hear those stories of both success and maybe challenges from participants. So I'm going to give it a second to see if anybody wants to volunteer their story. And if not, I know that I've worked with several of you on community consultations, and I am not afraid to call on you. So be prepared that could come.
And the value of community meetings, there's no price to that. Even though that you're the only one in the audience speaking on behalf, that has really moved mountains for me. And so Danae, you hit that, but those interactivities of places that you feel like you shouldn't be, but you need to get that message, are critical for the growth of any network. Sorry again.
No, I think that's great. I was just going to add, there is a question about navigate election cycles. So everybody knows on, well, not maybe everybody don't know, but on tribal nations, tribal elections can totally impact what's happening on to your networks and to your infrastructure. So on Nez Perce, we we have 9 tribal councilmen, women, both, but our council is elected on staggered 3-year terms. Some tribes are all council on a 2-year term, or some are on a rotating annual term. And so it really depends on the tribal nation. And honestly, the way that you set your network and your outreach up is has to be able to sustain your council, right? Has to live beyond your council. And so that community input, making sure that your community is engaged and knows the value of that input. And I'll talk about a little bit about the CARES Act funding that just recently came out. Cultural resources, that's fast money, right? We got the money, we got to deploy it really fast, and you have a specific time frame to deploy it. And so cultural resources has to, 106 has to be done on tribal lands in order to get your networks done. And how do you ensure? Well, you put the pressure of 300 homes on their shoulders and say, this is now your responsibility. We're putting this on you. You say you need 30 days. I need you to get it done in 2 weeks, because we have 300 homes on your shoulders right now. Are you going to tell them that they have to wait 60 days and miss their opportunity to have fiber to their home? So sharing that load and putting it on the next person to ensure that the gravity, the weight of connectivity is shared by everybody. So that's how you sustain beyond your elected officials.
Chris and Irene, do either of you guys want to comment on that as well, on navigating election cycles? I have a feeling you guys might have sort of different takes on it as well in terms of, levels of government and things like that.
One thing to keep in mind is that you shouldn't take care. I mean, and I wouldn't say you should never do this, but take care in letting the idea of a community network be something that is associated with one political party or candidate or something like that. Because if that person or group loses, then it may seem like the community has opposed the network when that may not have been the main reason that people voted the way they did. Generally, you want to try to have these things try to have wide resonance across different political views and things like that. The community networks that have been associated with governments, in my view, that have done the best are the ones that have often had unanimous support, where it doesn't seem like it's an idea of one particular ideology. It's more something that's seen as a practical response in the community.
No, and I agree with everything that Danae and Chris said. And I think, helping to be part of the process, part of when a new administration comes in, there's always a learning curve. And so to be ready, willing, and able to help educate the new leaders in terms of what has gone before and the potential for the future as well. But the more, the more engagement the more engagement, the better, from beginning to end and down the future, because networks and connectivity continue to grow and morph over time. They're not static, and the knowledge base isn't going to be static either.
Thanks. And then I saw, Crystal, that you have your hand raised. Do you want to go ahead and unmute?
Yeah, hi everyone. Thanks for giving me some time on the floor. So I'm from the Makah tribe in Washington State. Danae mentioned me earlier in her presentation. We're co-chairs for AT&I Telecom and Technology Subcommittee. But so my question forgive me, I had to step out and take care of my puppy. But so this might have gone over. You might have gone over this when I stepped out. During COVID, I mean, I realize that other tribes are at different stages as far as quarantine goes. I'm still in phase 1, and so we're still under shelter in place. And so what my challenge is doing that community outreach in an area where we're not allowed to go and be face to face, and we also have limited internet. So I mean, I heard something about pizza boxes and doing outreach like that, but I mean, how do you get that's one way to get information to people, but how are you getting information back? And are there any suggestions that people have that I might be able to do this in the next month or so?
So for Nez Perce, we've done a couple of different things. We're gamblers. Naturally, we gamble. Crystal, you come from a gambling community as well, traditional gambling. And so we placed bets on age groups, and age groups got to essentially gamble against each other, right? And so we used cash prizes. We used traditional prizes. We had individuals put up fishing gear and even in some cases beadwork, sewing. So we've done all kinds of different ways to incentivize responses, and volunteers oftentimes will help us by saying, I'll put this up. We've done barbecues as well, where we had individuals who completed the survey get invited to a barbecue. And of course, on this time, that wouldn't be something we could do, but we could do gift certificates. So right now, our census is doing something very similar, where by age group, the top 5 responders, the first 5 responders in each age group win a prize, and the census is providing that incentive to get responses back.
Nice.
Yeah, I think one thing is, of course, trying to meet outdoors in a socially distant means, if that's possible. I know on the West Coast that's also hindered by climate change fires, so may not be the best course of action. I don't know how, I think this varies a lot from community to community, but my impression is that a lot of people that we're trying to connect have some form of low, you know, I was going to say low latency, but not exactly, but they have some form of connection where they may be using, a mobile device or something like that. An email group that allows people to asynchronously, to communicate, to run ideas back and forth may be useful and not use a lot of bandwidth. A Facebook group, if a lot of people are using that, can also achieve that, where you don't have to all be communicating at the same time using a high bandwidth intensity application. So if you have people that are still finding ways to use email despite not having good connectivity at home, those sorts of solutions may be helpful. But it's hard to imagine what could make it more difficult than a pandemic coupled with fires right now. So I think it's hard to imagine what other ideas may come to do with that. But I mean, at that point, it's probably is about trying to get people to talk to their families, kind of deputizing people, and you have to have more of a flat structure to your organizing effort rather than one in which you kind of have one person that's doing most of the communicating. You really have to kind of deputize a lot of folks to go out and have those conversations.
Thank you.
Excellent. All right, so I think we've got time for about one more question. Does anybody want to be our closing question for the day? Okay, I'll give it a second in the chat. But in the meantime, I want to say a huge thank you to our speakers. Thank you guys so much for spending your day with us, for spending the time getting prepared for these sessions. I know I've learned a lot, and I'm really excited for the conversations that come as a result of these. So as a reminder to participants, if you would like to be connected with one of our speakers or with somebody else that you've been privately chatting with on the side, please let me know. I'm happy to make connections, and I'll reach out to that person ahead of time to make sure it's fine to do that. And then I'll set you guys up via email. If there are any other resources that you guys need from us in between sessions, please let me know. If you missed part of this session, it will be available on the participant webpage by Friday. And as a reminder, you can find that website and the password to the site in every week's calendar invitation. So we've got another great session next week, and be on the lookout for a survey that's coming out at the end of this week to sort of get a pulse on how you think things have gone so far, what's been the easiest way to participate, if there's anything else that you need from us, and all that good stuff. And as always, feel free to send me an email if you need anything. So seeing no additional questions with that, thanks again, and I hope you have a great day. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks very much.